Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for TheChessWorld.com. Welcome to this new course about the Pirc. Before we jump right into the action, let me start off by saying it is a pleasure and an honor for me to be recording this course for the Chess World. It is actually my first course for the Chess World, so hopefully it is a good one. Hopefully you enjoy it. And now we are ready to start our introduction to the Pirc, so let's dive in. We know the Pirc arises after e4, d6. Here white goes d4, we go knight f6, and white's main move here is knight to c3. So my opening approach when it comes to studying an opening is to focus on the ideas. It is to focus on the strategy behind an opening, the plans. I also like getting the sublines out of the way. What I mean by this is that here white has sublines we need to be aware of, and those are bishop d3 and f3. Once we get those out of the way, then we are ready to focus on knight c3, which is by far the main line. And that's probably the move we'll get in our games, but there's the occasional bishop d3 and f3. We also need to be prepared against those moves. So we'll start off by analyzing bishop d3. That's what we'll see in this chapter. In the next chapter we'll focus on f3, and from that chapter onwards we'll focus on knight c3, g6, and we'll also mention all of the lines white can play from this position onwards. So with that said, let's start with bishop d3. Sorry, not f3 there, that's next chapter. Right, so bishop d3 here. It is a natural move by white, but I feel that bishop on d3 is not great, as we'll soon learn after e5. Here white has knight f3. That's the most natural move, protecting the pawn on d4. There are other moves for white, by the way. Let me clear this arrow. Another move for white is to take on e5. There is c3 and there's also d5. In all of these lines you can notice already that that bishop on d3 is kind of stuck. It is not ideally placed, I would say, and we'll notice this concept in all of the lines we're about to see. So after e5, let's start off by analyzing d5. At first glance, d5 looks like a good move for white. However, there are some cons about this move as well. As soon as white plays d5, he's closing up the center. He's gaining some space, that's true, but on the other hand, by closing up the center, that gives us the freedom to plan something like f5 at some point. I'm not saying we have to play it right now. What I'm saying is, now that the center is closed, we can plan, we can prepare breaking up the center with f5, and we can do so by playing g6. We can play in a King's Indian fashion, King's Indian defense. We can play bishop g7, of course, castles, castles, and at some point we'll play f5. We can afford doing so because white closed up the center. If white had a pawn on the e4 here, there's no way we play f5 because white can easily take on e5, he can find ways to open up the center, and we're in trouble. Now that the center is closed, we can go for a kingside attack by playing f5 because we know there's no risk of white firing back in the center. So this is a basic concept in the King's Indian defense, and the reason I bring up the King's Indian defense, it's because the Pirc and the King's Indian, they are similar. When it comes to these openings, they share the same pawn structure. And let's not forget that white hasn't played knight c3 yet. So if white manages to place a pawn on c4, we are talking about the King's Indian. So it is good to know all of the kingside plans, the King's Indian plans, I mean. And that's why I'll mention the King's Indian defense quite a lot throughout the course. So coming back to our line after bishop d3, e5. Again, if white plays d5, that's fine for us. We can just continue in a King's Indian defense style by playing g6. The other bonus we get when white plays d5 is that we get control over the c5 square. We can exploit that by playing knight d7, knight c5 in some lines, especially when white plays something like c4. In some lines we can play knight a6, knight c5. We can even add a5 just to make sure we've got b4 under control, thus making knight c5, playing knight c5 safer. White won't be able to play b4, attacking our knight. So these are basic concepts when it comes to the King's Indian. Alright, so coming back to the Pirc, after e5, white has other moves to consider here. There's also pawn takes e5. I don't think this poses any threat to our opening here. We just take back. Now we see our bishop finds a new diagonal. As we mentioned before, that bishop on d3 is not special at all. I feel our bishops are potentially better, especially bishop f8 will find a better square than d6. I mean, we could just copy white and play bishop d6, but I feel c5 is better, as we'll soon see. And again, that bishop, I don't like it at all. It is crashing into e4. And after knight f3, here knight c6 is a great move, as I had in my analysis. There's also bishop d6, but that's just a copycat. I'm sure that's equal, but we can improve on that bishop d6, as I found in a game where black played bishop c5. There's no need to worry about the e5 pawn, because if white takes, then we've got a great tactic here. Queen d4, that's great looking at first glance, attacking both f2 and knight e5. The problem is white plays bishop b5 check, and then he takes our queen. We've got a better move here, and that is playing bishop takes f2 first. It is a check, so no in-betweeners for white, no in-between moves. After king takes, we've got queen d4 check. It is key that queen d4 is check, otherwise there are some tricks with bishop b5 check, and we lose our queen. But here, after queen d4, we check him. White has to move the king again. We take on e5. White lost the right to castle. There's an isolated pawn on e4, so I would say we are clearly better here. So after bishop c5, of course white is not going to take. He'll castle, and here I like knight bd7. There's a reason why I saved this arrow here. We could play knight c6 as well in order to protect the pawn on e5, and that's perfectly fine according to the engines, and we've got zero problems whatsoever. The thing is, if we want to be flexible, I don't want to give him any bishop b5 related ideas. I don't think it's good for white to play bishop b5 now, but maybe in future you can try something like that. And if I go knight bd7 instead, if he plays bishop b5, I can always play c6. That's why I prefer play knight bd7. With that said, knight c6 is playable and it is great for black. The other reason I like playing something like knight bd7, we'll see that reason in a moment. Queen e7 is what black played in a game I found, and a game you'll find in the BGN files, by the way. Now I'll come back to the knight bd7 idea. We can try, let's say we castle at some point. I'll just play some random moves to show you the ideas. I'll castle, let's say white goes knight bd2. I'm playing natural moves for both sides to show the idea for black here. I can go rook d8, attacking the bishop on d3, queen e2. Now, if I've got the knight on c6, that's okay. However, if I play knight bd7, I can think of ideas like knight f8, knight g6 and knight f4, or even knight f8, knight e6 and knight f4. So it feels like my knight on d7 has extra potential compared to c6. So that's the reason why I like playing knight bd7. Again, it all depends on how white plays. We cannot make rules and follow them all the time, but it is a good concept to know that the knight transfer to the king side via f8. And as I mentioned earlier, that's something that happens in the King's Indian as well. So the other thing, before I finish this line, is that it is good to have c6 handy, because as we'll see in the game I found where white played bishop g5, now we'll see why I did those arrows. But after bishop g5, imagine he plays something like knight c3, knight d5. If we've got c6, then that's not a problem. If I have a knight on c6, then this might be an issue, because there's no easy way for us to deal with knight d5. So again, just to make our life easier, having a knight on d7 or having a pawn on c6, it is a good idea for us. So just to finish this line, white played bishop g5 in this game. I don't think it's a good move, because we've got c6, we've got nothing to worry about, and after bishop g5 we can simply play h6, asking white's bishop what this is gonna do. And I don't think taking on f6 is great. We get the bishop pair and white gets nothing in return. And if white goes back, if he goes to h4, the thing is, we haven't castled kingside yet, which is totally fine, by the way. We can castle kingside and play, as we mentioned earlier, rook d8, knight d7, we transfer the knight to f8. We've got a great position here. Another thing I should add, just in case, is that if white plays the natural c3, another great move we should consider is a5, just to make sure he doesn't gain a lot of space on the queen side. But after that, I feel our plans remain the same. Rook d8, knight d7, knight f8, and I'm sure there's more than that. This is just a random position we're analyzing, but I like naming all the plans I know, because after all, that's the most relevant thing, is to remember the plans, to simulate the plans. So, alright, bishop h4. As I was saying, we haven't castled yet. That's risky for white, because since our king's still here, we could think about something like, let's say, bishop g4, knight d7, we castle queenside, and once our king is on the queenside, we can easily fire a kingside attack because our king is no longer there. So quite a risky enterprise for white to play bishop g5 here, unless he takes on f6. I don't see the point of playing bishop g5. You can check the game on the PCN files, and you'll see this is not a challenging line at all for black. Alright, so what else? After e5 here, what else can white play? Alright, so there's c3. Here I found an easy and effective way to equalize as black on the spot, and that is by playing d5. There are other lines we can consider playing. As you know, we're at move 4 and several moves can be played here. We could consider playing something like knight c6, trying to get the king's Indian position we discussed earlier. The thing is, after d5 we could play both knight b8 and knight e7, and the resultant position is quite interesting. Now the center is closed. We could play knight g6, knight f4. If we want to play something like g6, that's alright too. Since the center is closed, we want to play f5 at some point. That's the idea in the king's Indian. So here, let's play a few moves. I want to share a concept that I believe it's key to know, whether we play knight h5, knight e7, knight e8, you name it. There's one thing we need to be aware of when it comes to playing f5. Please be aware of the fact that there is always something like knight g5 available for white, and we have to watch out for this because it could get ugly if we don't pay attention. For instance, let's say white goes, I don't know, b4, and we go f5. Knight g5 is quite dangerous, even if we manage to control e6. Let's say we go knight f6. Well, he can always try something like knight e6, and even if we take that pawn on e6, white has a lot of compensation because of the bishop pair, because of the fact he can open that position up on light squares, playing c5, queen b3, bishop c4. There are so many lines where white has compensation, or even more than that. Here, for instance, it is easy to believe that queen c8 wins a pawn. However, white has knight to d5, and suddenly we're in trouble. If we take on e6, he takes on c7, and we lose the exchange. If we play something else, something like knight takes d5, then he gets that powerful pawn on e6. We will never be able to get rid of it. So these are common tricks in the king's Indian defense, and as I said before, we need to be aware of knight g5. It also happens when we play knight h5, by the way. It might be okay in some lines, it is okay to allow this, but I recommend having knight g5 under control. Perhaps playing h6 before, and then we can focus on playing f5. Again, this is all king's Indian defense stuff, but we're likely to get positions like this when white plays a subline against the Pirc. So those are the reasons why I'm mentioning king's Indian stuff. And now, with all that said, we don't have to play knight c6 here. We can play d5, which is effective, and it clears up the center right from the get-go and leaves white with zero chances of an opening advantage, as we'll soon see here. After d5, white takes on e5. If he plays the other move, which is taking on d5, we just play queen takes d5, and now g2 is hanging, so is d4, and white is in trouble already, so he'll take on e5, and here knight takes e4. Right, at first glance, it feels like something's wrong, because after bishop takes e4, white could trade queens off on d8 and we lose the right to castle. So we'll see that that's not as good as it seems for white. After bishop takes e4, we take. If he takes on d8, that's fine. We just stay back, and we've got the bishop pair here. That's a big deal, especially in endgames and the open positions. The bishop pair is good for us. Not to mention we've got knight d7, knight c5. We've got a lot of options here, and again, the pair of bishops is what gives us the advantage. And also the fact that queens are off, that's great for us, because our king on d8, it is safe. If queens were on board, then of course having the king on d8, having lost the right to castle, that's a big deal. But since we've got a queen-less position, our king on d8 is safe and sound. So here, after pawn takes e5, knight takes e4, the other line we need to focus on is bishop takes, pawn takes, queen a4 check. Now, as we can see, white is about to win a pawn. However, after bishop d7, queen takes e4, bishop c6, we get a lot of compensation, and white just keeps moving its queen around. Queen g4, white has to keep an eye on g2. Yeah, let me fix the arrow. I don't know why I had queen d6 there. Of course, that's a terrible idea. I probably meant queen d5, but even here queen d5 is not great because there is queen c8 check. We got to be aware of that. But we can play h5 first, and after queen g3. Now, we can play queen d5. I would love to play knight d7 and queenside castle here. We've got a massive compensation, and as I said before, white just keeps moving its queen around. He's got an extra pawn, but in practice it is difficult to defend. This is white, and even with that extra pawn, white is worse. We know that, especially in openings, material is not what matters. What matters is development, piece play, initiative. And here, white is just moving the queen around, whereas black is getting every single piece out. We are likely to punish white anytime soon from here onwards. So, I like this gambit. If white takes on e4 and queen a4 check, the main line is likely to be knight f3. And here I like following a line that resembles the Petrov, or also known the Russian defense, knight c6. Here white plays knight bd2, challenging that knight on e4. If white castles, we can still follow the same plan black played in the main line. By the way, you'll find all this on the PGN files. Knight bd2, and here I like knight c5. And let me explain why I like retreating our knight to c5 instead of taking on d2. If we take on d2, it's not the end of the world, but after bishop takes d2, we can see how those bishops are targeting our king side, and we don't really have a lot of pieces protecting that area of the board. And as like saying, we don't have our kingside defender. What do I mean by a kingside defender? I'm talking about knight f6. Now if we flip the board for a second, here we see a kingside defender, and that's knight f3. We can see how that knight is protecting white's kingside. Black cannot even consider playing something like queen h4, because there is a knight on f3. Black, on the other hand, doesn't have a knight on f6, and it is good to think about stuff like this in the long run, because if we play knight c5 instead, first of all, it's not going to be easy for white to attack on the king side, and second of all, we can try getting rid of that attacker, which is bishop d3. After bishop c2, there's another key move here, bishop to g4. We have to play this here, because otherwise, let's say we go something like bishop e7, which is a natural move. Well, first of all, he can play something like h3, and then our bishop on c8 will struggle to find good squares, and also he could play something like b4, and our knight is forced to move to e6 or d7, and both moves are blockading my bishop on c8. I don't want to do that, so by playing bishop g4 first, here, knight b2, knight c5, bishop c2. By playing bishop g4 first, I can play knight e6 afterwards, and my bishop is already on the right side of the board, it's already on g4. Most importantly, I can go bishop h5, bishop g6, and then I make sure I trade white's most important attacker at the moment. The other bonus to bishop g4 is the fact I can consider playing queen d7 and castle queenside, which might be useful depending on what white plays, and I can always stick to the standard plan, which is bishop e7 and castling kingside, of course. The other thing, which is important after bishop g4, is that the knight on e6 is ideally placed, because there's no better piece to blockade a pawn than a knight. A knight on e6 is going to be excellent, and that also explains why I like playing knight c5 here. So you'll find games in the PGN files with knight c5, with the other line we mentioned, with here with pawn takes e5, d5. I don't think this is a threat, because if we just play in a King's Indian fashion, we'll be doing great with the closed center. And the other line we need to analyze, and we'll see that in the next video, is knight to f3. That's the last line we have to see before we move on to the f3 line, which is the other subline we have to see apart from bishop d3. And after we study all of these lines, then we'll be ready to start with knight c3, which is by far the main move. So I think that's a lot of information for the first video, for the introduction. I hope you found this useful. I hope you could learn something. And of course, I want to see you guys in the next video. Thank you.